Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to Merryn Talks Your Money, the personal finance edition of Merryn Talks Money. In these bonus podcasts, we talk about the best strategies for making the most of your money. I'm Merryn Somerset Webb, Bloomberg UK Wealth Editor-at-Large, and with me, senior reporter and author of the award-winning newsletter Money Distilled, John Stepek. Hi, John.
Hi, Merryn.
Special day, right? We're about to do something we don't normally do, a mini-series. And this one is going to be on the one thing, apart from gold and Bitcoin, that our listeners really, really care about. Yeah, it's housing.
Hooray!
I know. And every week we're going to look at a different topic. We're going to cover everything you need to know from what the market looks like at the moment, how we expect it to look, or rather how other people expect it to look, and everything you need to know about how to get on that ladder.
Yeah, that's right. We're really excited about this, assuming we can handle the commitment to planning ahead that far for an entire series.
John!
I'm just saying.
I'm a planner, I can plan. Anyway, we have to plan because it's a whole series and we're going to cover every single topic that you need to know about when it comes to looking for a house in the UK, looking at the UK property market and figuring out how to deal with it. And we're going to start with the most important episode, one that talks about the market as a whole, where it is right now and how to look at it. And in the next couple of weeks, we're going to cover everything from how to get a mortgage broker, whether you should have a mortgage broker, whether you need a buying agency. Probably, spoiler alert, you do. Shared ownership, is it worth it? You got a spoiler alert on that one, John?
It's not.
It's not. Who could have guessed? Is buying a new property always a mistake? Again, maybe no spoiler alert there. Freehold versus leasehold, which is better? Why is it better? I think we all instinctively know the answer to that, but we will tell you about it in detail. And a couple more topics aside, so there is a lot. John is so excited about this.
I just cannot wait. And I just want to say...
Yes, you say it in that voice, but it's not true. You don't mean it. You really are interested. Every time more property numbers come out, you are always mad to write a column about property. You know it's going to be read by everybody, right?
Yeah, I do love the clickbait.
So on to the show. Today you're going to be hearing a conversation I had with Professor of Real Estate Yolande Barnes. Professor Barnes teaches at University College of London and is an expert in, as she puts it, thinking about things that people in the real estate industry aren't yet thinking about. We discuss why the enormous rise of house prices in the UK looks set to fade, so that'll be nice, why your first home should actually be your forever home, and why she thinks it's possible that quite soon the UK will not have too few homes, but too many homes. Heard it here first, right, John?
She sounds great.
Yeah, she is.
I'm looking forward to hearing this one.
Listen in. Yolande, thank you and welcome to this podcast. You are our first guest in our property series, so we really appreciate you coming in.
It's a real pleasure to be here. It's an honour.
Great. Well, we're going to try and cover a massive topic in a relatively short amount of time. So what I would love it if you could do for us, just as a starter, is give us a very general overview of what's happening in the UK residential property market at the moment. I mean, prices, as we know, have been relatively flat for quite a long time now. So it looks like the bubble at least is over. But there is no crash, obviously. There's lots of regional variation, lots of variation between different types of housing. But things are kind of flat. Is that fair?
I think that's very fair. I actually say we've come to the end of the sort of late 20th century great inflation, which, of course, included asset price inflation. So by my reckoning, about half of the 600% or so growth that we've seen since the 1990s has been down simply to the reduction in interest rates, which means we're capitalising the value of housing at a lower rate than we did. And that's caused automatic house price inflation. So that's out of the system now. We can't rely on that. The housing market escalator isn't going up anymore. And the only way I think we're going to see values rise in housing is through genuine value add. There are market forces at play where basically a lot of people want a house and there's limited supply of that type of house.
Okay, so we still have very high demand for housing in the UK, although we always say on this show we have to be careful to distinguish between genuine economic demand and stuff people want but can't afford, because that's a different thing altogether, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could say demand for housing is almost infinite. I mean, the way I think of it is until everybody is living in a mansion, probably none of us are fully housed.
But that's not real demand. That's not economic demand. That's stuff people want, which really doesn't have any impact on the market.
Well, it has an impact on consumer markets, of course. If we were talking about a consumer good, we would be talking about demand for luxury goods or whatever. It's not quite a straight relationship between one household equals demand for one home. And actually, we've been occupying larger and larger homes over the years. When we're talking about supply, we've got to consider a strong qualitative element of that supply.
Okay, so when you look out, let's say over the next decade, you would expect to see house prices flat-ish in nominal terms, possibly falling slightly in real terms. Is that fair?
Yeah, I suppose in the long run, you would expect housing to pretty much follow inflation in other goods and services, which means no real growth.
Yeah, and that's even though we're seeing fairly strong wage growth in the UK. So you might say that if wages grow more strongly than inflation over the next 10-year period, you could expect to see house prices rise along with wages as opposed to along with inflation.
If demand exceeds supply, and with the big sort of emphasis on the quality of demand and the quality of supply, then you would expect to see house prices rise. However, I think there are big questions around both demand and supply going forward as well. I think that come next year, we're actually going to start to see a surplus in the market. This goes completely against a lot of the thinking that's sort of driving the supply side issues. But the plain fact is that we have been aging, but we've become aged. So the rate of death is going to go up and homes are going to be vacated through executor sales. At the same time, because of demographic changes and particularly fertility rates and so forth, the rate of household formation is going down. So through simple demographic effects, you've got simultaneously a rising number of homes being vacated by older people downsizing or becoming deceased. And at the same time, you've got still growing household numbers, but at a much lower rate than we've been used to in the past. And so the two lines are kind of moving away from each other. And in the middle, you get a surplus. Now, bear in mind that 90% of the market is supplied from second-hand stock. It's not supplied by the speculative house builders who are kind of a specialist niche building about 10% of stock in any one year. That means that the second-hand market has the biggest impact on prices. And speculative house builders are price takers, not price makers. So regardless of how much new stock we add, there is going to be much greater surplus of the stock that most people buy any given year.
Interesting. And that sounds like if you're talking about that housing free up because of the older people dying, that suggests that the surplus will be at the higher end of the market, larger home, rural homes, etc., as opposed to, say, the two-bedroom flat end of the market.
Absolutely. It will tend to be what you might call street properties, the single-family homes, rather than the multifamily housing.
So, Yolande, here I am. I'm coming to you. I'm a young person, well, youngish, and maybe I've got a small family. Maybe I'm married and I've got 2 kids. What do you recommend I buy? What do you recommend I do in a market like this? I mean, maybe I should just rent.
I still think there are very good reasons to buy. I suppose my biggest concern, and I think one of the ways that we've sort of been characterizing affordability in relation to incomes isn't very helpful, because, of course, if you could be exactly the same young person with the same family and have access somehow to capital, to equity, or you could be somebody who doesn't. So a lot of whether you enter the conventional housing market depends on whether you have equity for housing. So usually that's called the bank of mum and dad, or it might increasingly be inheritance. But the world kind of divides into equity haves and equity have-nots. Before you even start to think about the type of property you buy, you're having to think about the nature of your finance. And that's going to affect the affordability. But let's assume you've managed to save a sufficient deposit to obtain a mortgage. I think the first tip is to think very carefully about all those other costs of what you're buying. and that you can not only afford the mortgage, but you can also afford the energy costs and the maintenance and upkeep. I suspect your mortgage supplier will increasingly be asking that question. One home is always going to be worth one home to you. So I think the trick, and this is something that people have been doing anyway, is when you do buy your forever home or the home you're going to stay longest in, because the costs of trading, there's no longer the option really to trade up every rung of the so-called housing ladder. It doesn't work like that. The costs of trading are just too high to make that worthwhile. So what you want to do is just buy the home in the location that you can see yourself being happy to be in for the next, 30 years, the place where you're happy to raise those children. And so neighborhood is becoming much, much more important, I think, than just the individual sort of property. It really is the most important choice you'll make. I mean, the old adage, buy the worst house in the best street, is sometimes a good one, because I suppose this comes back to the fact that when you're buying a home, actually what you're buying is land. It's the land value that's going to take up the most of the value of a lot of properties throughout the country. It's very rare that the costs of building the home are greater than the value of the home. So the remainder is land value. That's the locational value. And that's why neighbourhood's so important. So look at the neighbourhood and the livability and what you want to get out, the utility and amenity you want to extract, as it were, from your home over a substantial period of time. And then actually what happens to house prices doesn't matter very much because you're housed at a price you can afford in a place you love. And that's the name of the game. And that means quite possibly taking a lot longer to purchase a home than maybe we've been used to.
Okay, interesting. So the key advice there is to buy assuming you're not moving.
Yeah, I think so.
Do you see divisions in the market, i.e. regional divisions between London, where prices have in certain segments of London have definitely been falling faster than in other areas? And we've seen some big problems in prime London, right, depending on how you view a problem, obviously. But prime London prices have been struggling and flat prices in London have been struggling. But there have been some areas in the north where we've seen quite impressive price rises, right? So there's quite a lot of regional disparity in here as well.
Yeah, I think this is what most analysts would call a late cycle play. This is exactly what you'd expect after the immense rises that we saw in London and the South after COVID. I think it's the North playing catch up.
Okay. I was vaguely hoping you might tell us that it was excitement about the reindustrialisation of the UK and house prices moving in advance of a productivity boom in the Midlands and the North. But yeah, I'm going to keep hoping for that one.
Area of expertise there.
I'll keep hoping for that one. So from what you're saying, it rather suggests that the UK government's plan to build, which everyone knows that won't happen, but nonetheless it's a plan like it is for all governments. And actually that plan isn't strictly speaking necessary.
It is not only not necessary, it could be quite damaging in certain respects. One of the things that I'm most conscious of is that actually the sort of fuel poverty or energy poverty of many households means that we could much more productively, I think, concentrate house building, as it were, or home building to the retrofit of homes to reduce energy costs. And quite simply, making existing homes better would supply the market. We don't necessarily have to build from scratch. And of course, it's a very expensive thing. You have problems of land supply if you're building completely new homes on barefield land. So we set ourselves a very, very difficult thing to do. And in particular, a very difficult thing to do given the paucity of sort of business models and economic models to actually deliver the housing. Britain is really, really odd amongst any certainly European nation in completely relying on speculative house builders to create new supply of housing. The rate of self-procurement, community build, self-build is much, much higher elsewhere. So there's much greater diversity of ways of getting yourself a home than buying off a house builder.
And that's kind of a planning problem in the UK, isn't it? Pot planning, pot cultural.
I don't think it's a planning problem so much as we need to create new industries. I mean, this is a growth story, in my view, that if you really want to expand the economy through construction, you need to actually create more ways of owning and stewarding and developing and maintaining and repairing land and buildings than we currently have.
I've really enjoyed you calling the house builders the speculative house builders, by the way. I think we need to do another podcast on that. It's not for this one, but let's do that one another time.
Sure.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you about is that when people go out into the market, particularly first-time buyers and maybe last-time buyers as well, they often think that what they need is a flat, not a house. So they look at the market and they go, well, I'm buying something quite small, maybe 1,000 square foot or smaller, whatever it is, because I'm a young person or I'm an old person downsizing. So I should definitely only be looking at flats as opposed to houses. But you have spoken quite interestingly about the mistake that we make when we want to live in smaller spaces or we want to live in dense spaces, in thinking that if we want to live in a high density way, we need to live in a high rise way. And this doesn't necessarily correlate.
Yes. Let's dispel the myth that high rise means high density. You can get just as high density with mid-rise sort of townhouses or modern mansion blocks. You certainly don't have to go high rise to get density. And where we have built not only high rise buildings, but what I call massive buildings, big block flatted housing. So a mid-rise would be the mansion block. It's also a slim block, a street-based building that is not deep. Whereas because of peculiarities in planning laws and various other things, we have been building massive blocks, which may be, let's say, 10 stories high. So not high rise in the conventional sense of towers, but also very deep buildings with a lot of communal sort of distribution space internally. And that causes problems because the cost of maintenance and upkeep of those buildings is significantly higher. I mean, really, in some cases, problematically higher than simpler buildings on a street-based sort of grid. So the sort of things apartments that we've been building over the last 30 years or so are inherently more expensive to run. And Le Corbusier talked about towers being machines for living in. And these are expensive machines for living in. So apart from anything else, you might want, say, the lift and all that plant and machinery replaced after, say, 30 years. That's a very expensive undertaking. Even where you don't have those sorts of problems, you've got a lot of corridors and lobbies, communal spaces to heat, light, decorate and refurbish over time.
Well, I was thinking earlier, Yolande, about windows. I was thinking about, let's look at this very simply. In a 2 or 3 story house, it's not that hard to clean the windows. Once you get above 4, 5, 6 stories, you're talking about proper scaffolding or men dangling from the roof, etc., etc. So pretty much everything becomes significantly more expensive.
Yes. And if we built buildings with, say, these pod bathrooms that were craned into place as they were built, everyone got very excited about modern methods of construction. But what happens when that bathroom needs replacing? It becomes quite a difficult technical issue because you sure as heck aren't going to be able to get a crane up there to replace the pod. So I think there are all sorts of costs associated with some of the things that we've been built that will start to exacerbate that polarization that you started to talk about in the market, that between the simple terraced house or street property versus the 2-bedroom flat in the 12th floor of a big block. There's quite a world of difference in the sort of lifetime costs of running those two homes.
Yeah, and we've heard a lot recently about people buying flats, leaseholds, and that's changing, obviously, with the new regulations, but the cost will remain the same. And seeing their service charges ratchet up over and over to levels that they certainly didn't expect when they bought. And it's kind of an interesting example of how these costs keep moving in directions people simply didn't expect because they didn't understand how much more expensive it is per square foot to maintain a whopping great building like this relative to a 3-bedroom terraced house.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of angst and problems starting to come up around service charges. And these service charges are, in some cases, artificially low right now because they haven't got what's called the sinking fund to pay for the future repair and maintenance and replacement of plant, for example. So they look reasonable and artificially low. They can only go up as time goes on. And of course, maybe people didn't mind paying a big service charge when the value of the home was rising by many times more than that service charge every year.
Yeah.
But I think if we're into a very low growth, or relatively low growth period for home prices, then you're really going to start noticing the cost of maintenance and upkeep and service charges.
Yeah, and that should make a long-term difference to the value of the flats and the price at which they can sold, which presumably you can already see people getting instinctively because the prices of leasehold flats are lower than you might have expected a decade ago.
Exactly. You're going to have to somehow capitalise your costs over the time you expect to occupy the home, and you're going to want to get that knocked off the capital value at the purchase. Simple as that. This is what I mean by the qualitative nature of supply. There's going to be these big sort of qualitative differences between the good homes and the expensive homes, expensive to run homes.
I think we've covered the basics of the housing market, how it looks and how people should be looking at it at the moment. Is there anything you can think of that we've missed on that conversation?
The housing market, I've often said, is not a single market. It's a series of sub-markets all behaving in different ways. So there are big sort of global influences like the reduction in interest rates, which has a really powerful effect. But what it means is that there are just so many caveats and conditions on what I've just said that it's very difficult to talk in general terms. But I think the main point is that we've got to get used to the 21st century being a different environment. I think the more we look back on it, the more we'll see the late 20th century as an abnormal period in history when, inflation and interest rates and growth and prices went crazy. And we're in for something quite different, I think, going forward.
Yolande, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Merryn Talks Your Money. If you like our show, rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Also be sure to follow me and John on X or Twitter at MerrynSW and John_Stepek. This episode was produced by Summer Sadi and Moses Andam. Sound design by Blake Maples. Special thanks to Professor Yolande Barnes. Questions and comments on this show and all our shows are always welcome. Our show email is merrynmoney@bloomberg.net.